The woman convicted of murdering Mexican-American music star Selena has been denied parole.
I didn't know how to operate a gun. I've never had one. And so,
for nearly 3 decades, the world believed it understood what happened on March 31st, 1995. A beloved star, a trusted employee, a gun, an ending that shattered millions of hearts across the globe. The case was tried, the verdict was delivered, and the story was quietly filed away under the category of tragic, but resolved. But resolved doesn't always mean understood. And understood doesn't always mean complete. Because the more time passes, the more voices begin to surface. Voices that were once too afraid to speak. Voices that were silenced by loyalty, by grief, by the enormous machinery of a family empire that had very specific ideas about what the world should and should not know. And now, 30 years later, those voices are beginning to say something uncomfortable. Something that doesn't fit the clean, approved narrative. Something that forces us to ask a question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. Was the tragedy of Selena Quintanilla entirely unpreventable? Or were the warning signs there all along? And did the people closest to her choose, for reasons of their own, to look the other way? The answer, as it turns out, is not comforting. And the mystery, once you see it clearly, isn't really a mystery at all. It's something worse. It's a pattern. To understand what happened in that motel room, you have to understand who Selena Quintanilla really was. Not the polished icon frozen in time on concert posters and tribute murals, but the living, breathing, complex human being who existed behind the sequins and the smile. Selena was born on April 16, 1971, in Lake Jackson, Texas. From the moment her father recognized her voice as something extraordinary, the trajectory of her life was shaped almost entirely by someone else's vision. Abraham Quintanilla Jr., a former musician whose own career never reached the heights he had dreamed of, poured every unfulfilled ambition into his daughter. He formed the family band Selena y Los Dinos when Selena was just 9 years old. He became her manager, her gatekeeper, and in many ways, the architect of every major decision she would ever make. By her early 20s, Selena was the undisputed queen of Tejano music. She had Grammy Awards, sold-out arenas, a clothing line, and a fan base so devoted they named streets after her. She was also, by nearly every account from those who knew her personally, profoundly kind. She remembered names. She stayed after shows to take photographs. She treated fans like family. That warmth was absolutely real, and it was also, tragically, part of what made her vulnerable. Because Selena had a deep and genuine tendency to see the best in people, even when the evidence around her strongly suggested she shouldn't. The relationship between Selena and her father Abraham is one of the most complicated dynamics in the history of popular music, and it is one that the family-approved narrative has consistently smoothed over. Abraham was, without question, instrumental in building Selena's career. His dedication was genuine, his sacrifices were real, and his love for his daughter was never seriously in dispute. But love and control are not mutually exclusive. And, in Abraham Quintanilla's world, they were frequently indistinguishable from each other. Abraham controlled Selena's music. He controlled her public image. He dictated her recording direction, managed her touring schedule, and for a significant portion of her adult life, he controlled her romantic choices as well. When Selena fell in love with Chris Perez, the band's guitarist, Abraham did not simply express parental concern. He fired Chris on the spot. He issued an ultimatum. He forced his own daughter to choose between her heart and her career, between her personal autonomy and the empire he had constructed around her name. Selena and Chris ultimately eloped in secret in April 1992. That single act speaks volumes about the world she was living in. This was not a woman freely making choices about her own life. This was a woman forced to smuggle her own love story out of sight, to hide her own marriage from the people she worked with every day. Abraham eventually accepted the marriage, but the dynamic it had exposed, that Selena's most personal decisions were still subject to his approval, never truly changed. What this environment created over many years was a woman who had become exceptionally skilled at managing the expectations of the people around her. She had learned to smooth over conflict, to avoid confrontation, to prioritize keeping the peace even when a situation clearly demanded something more forceful. It made her, in the most heartbreaking sense, too accommodating for her own safety. Yolanda Saldivar did not appear in Selena's life as a threat. She appeared, at first, as a gift. In 1991, Yolanda approached Abraham Quintanilla with a proposal. She wanted to found an official Selena fan club. It was an organized, enthusiastic idea, and Abraham approved it without hesitation. What followed was a carefully constructed, slow-building campaign of access and trust. Yolanda threw herself into the role completely. She attended every event. She answered every piece of fan mail. She was always present, always available, always eager to do more than was asked of her. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she shifted from being a dedicated fan to becoming a permanent fixture in Selena's world. By the mid-1990s, Yolanda had been handed the management of Selena's boutiques, Selena, etc., in both Corpus Christi and San Antonio. She controlled the bank accounts, supervised the payroll, managed the vendor relationships, and handled confidential financial records. She had been given access to documents that touched nearly every corner of Selena's business life. And she had been handed all of this with almost no formal oversight, no independent auditing, and no meaningful checks on her authority. In a professionally managed operation, this would have been unthinkable. But this wasn't a professionally managed operation in the conventional sense. This was a family business built on personal loyalty, and Yolanda had positioned herself brilliantly and deliberately as the most loyal person in the room. Employees at the boutiques had begun raising concerns about Yolanda well before the situation reached a crisis point. Staff reported missed paychecks. They described expenses that made no logical sense. They spoke about an atmosphere of intimidation, where questioning Yolanda's authority meant risking your job. Some employees described her as emotionally manipulative, capable of turning colleagues against one another, of manufacturing crises to make herself appear indispensable, of using fear as a management tool. One designer who worked closely with her described a woman who controlled through deception and kept everyone around her slightly destabilized. These were not minor, isolated complaints. These were serious, consistent, corroborated concerns raised by multiple people over an extended stretch of time. And yet the response from those overseeing the operation was slow, cautious, and ultimately inadequate. The reason was not negligence in the ordinary sense. The reason was that Yolanda was Selena's person. She was the fiercely devoted protector, the tireless worker, the woman who would do anything for the singer she idolized. In a family that had always been deeply suspicious of outsiders, Yolanda had managed to become something rare, an insider. And that status shielded her from the scrutiny that anyone else in her position would have faced immediately and without question. By early 1995, the financial irregularities could no longer be explained away or quietly absorbed. An internal investigation confirmed what employees had been saying for months. Money was missing. Records had been falsified or altered. The full scope of the damage was still being assessed, but what had been uncovered was already damning enough to demand immediate action. On March 9, 1995, Selena Abraham and her sister Suzette sat down with Yolanda and placed the evidence directly in front of her. Yolanda denied everything. She deflected, minimized, and refused to accept any responsibility whatsoever. Faced with documentation that contradicted her at every turn, she simply refused to engage with it honestly. Abraham issued the order. Yolanda was to be removed from all business operations immediately. Her access was to be terminated. Her involvement in Selena's professional life was over. But there was a complication. Yolanda had not surrendered all of the documents. Critical financial records, the kind needed to properly audit the damage and restore order to the companies, were still in her possession. Selena, ever practical, ever the person who tried to resolve problems rather than let them fester, decided that she would retrieve them herself. She arranged a private meeting with Yolanda at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi. She scheduled it for the morning of March 31, 1995. She went alone. She went because she believed she could handle it. She went because she had known Yolanda for years and could not bring herself to fully accept that this woman, who had declared such overwhelming love and devotion to her, would cause her real harm. She went because the habits of a lifetime had taught her to be the one who kept things together, who closed the difficult conversations, who absorbed the discomfort so that everyone else could move on. She was 23 years old, trying to protect what she had built, and she did not believe she was walking into danger. At 11:48 in the morning, hotel staff heard a single gunshot from inside room 158. Moments later, Selena emerged from that room bleeding heavily from a wound to her lower right shoulder. She ran through the corridor, leaving a trail of blood on the floor behind her. She made it to the lobby before her body gave out. The words she managed to speak as she collapsed, that she had been shot, and who had shot her, were the last coherent words she ever said. She was transported to Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital. The damage to her body was catastrophic. A hollow-point bullet had torn through a major artery, causing massive internal bleeding that could not be stopped. She was pronounced dead at 1:05 in the afternoon. The world she had been building, the English-language crossover album, the expanding fashion empire, the marriage to a man she had loved enough to risk everything for, the future she had written about in private journals that nobody else was ever supposed to read. All of it ended in the hallway of a budget motel on a Tuesday morning in South Texas. Yolanda Saldivar's defense was built on a single claim, that the shooting had been an accident, that the gun had discharged unintentionally during some kind of struggle, that she had never meant to harm the woman she described as her closest friend and greatest inspiration. It was the story she told in court, and it was the story the jury rejected after deliberating for less than 3 hours. The forensic evidence was clear and detailed. The trajectory of the bullet wound was inconsistent with an accidental discharge. The angle, the placement, and the type of ammunition used, a hollow-point round specifically designed to maximize internal damage, were all inconsistent with a misfire. Medical experts who analyzed the wound described it as consistent with a direct, intentional shot fired at a person who was attempting to leave. The damage it caused was not the kind of damage that happens by accident. Perhaps most revealing of all was Yolanda's behavior in the immediate aftermath. After the shot was fired, she did not call for emergency services. She did not attempt to render first aid. She did not do any of the things that a person who had just accidentally shot someone they deeply loved would instinctively do in those first panic seconds. Instead, she walked to her truck in the motel parking lot, locked the doors, and held police at bay for nearly 10 hours in a standoff that was broadcast live on local and national television. The footage of that standoff, Yolanda sitting in the truck, the gun pressed to her own head at various points, police negotiators working through the afternoon and into the evening, became one of the most surreal and haunting pieces of footage in the history of Texas crime coverage. Yolanda Saldivar was convicted of first-degree murder in October 1995 and sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after serving 30 years. The verdict was swift and the sentence was clear, but for the people who had loved Selena, no courtroom outcome was ever going to feel like justice. It was only ever going to feel like the formal acknowledgement of an irreversible loss. In March 2025, 30 years after the crime, Yolanda Saldivar became eligible for parole consideration. The announcement landed like a shockwave. It had been 30 years, and yet for millions of people, the wound had never properly closed. The reaction was immediate, organized, and overwhelming. Fans built petitions that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Vigils were held in Corpus Christi and Los Angeles. Online campaigns pushed back against the possibility of early release with a force that reflected something deeper than celebrity devotion. It reflected a collective, unresolved grief and a fierce insistence that the life that had been taken deserved to be weighed seriously against the freedom now being requested. On March 27, 2025, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles formally denied Saldivar's parole request. Their statement was direct. They cited the brutality of the crime. They noted the premeditated nature of the act. Specifically, the deliberate choice to lure Selena to a private location under the pretense of a routine document exchange, and then to shoot her as she attempted to walk away. The board concluded that Saldivar continued to represent a risk, and that the circumstances of the crime did not support early release. The decision was met with relief by Selena's family and by fans around the world, though it carried with it the particular, aching quality of a victory that cannot give back a single thing that was taken. What made the parole proceedings additionally troubling was the way Saldivar had chosen to conduct herself in the months leading up to the hearing. Rather than presenting herself as someone who had spent 30 years genuinely grappling with the weight of what she had done, she gave interviews in which she began to quietly revise her account of that morning. She suggested that Selena had been confrontational. She implied that the situation had escalated in ways that were not entirely her fault. She repositioned herself carefully and deliberately, not as someone who had committed a devastating act of premeditated violence, but as someone who had been trapped in a terrible moment that the victim had somehow helped to create. Legal analysts were blunt in their response. Parole boards are specifically evaluating two things above all else: genuine accountability and credible evidence of rehabilitation. What Saldivar offered instead was a continued, barely disguised reluctance to fully accept the reality of what she had done. Criminal psychologists who reviewed her public statements noted that the behavior was consistent with a long-established pattern. Someone who, even after 3 decades of incarceration, was still more focused on controlling the narrative of the story than on honestly reckoning with her role in it. The board's denial was not just a legal decision. It was a direct response to everything Saldivar had revealed about herself through the very way she chose to ask for her freedom. The case of Selena Quintanilla has always been treated as a story with a clear beginning and a devastating end. But the truth that has emerged over 30 years is that the story was never that simple. It was always a story about the conditions that made the ending possible. It was a story about what happens when warning signs are minimized because the person raising them is considered too valuable to lose. It was a story about what happens when a young woman's instinct toward trust and resolution is never balanced by the people around her with a serious, honest conversation about risk. Employees raised concerns about Yolanda Saldivar for months before that morning. Those concerns were not acted on with the urgency they deserved. A woman with a documented history of manipulation, financial dishonesty, and emotional volatility was permitted to maintain access to the most sensitive parts of Selena's professional life long after there was clear, documented reason to remove her entirely. And Selena herself, shaped by years of navigating a family dynamic that rewarded compliance and discouraged confrontation, walked into that motel room because no one had truly and forcefully conveyed to her how serious the situation had become. None of that makes her responsible for what was done to her. None of it shifts even a fraction of the moral weight of that morning onto anyone other than the woman who pulled the trigger. But it does mean that the tragedy of Selena Quintanilla is not simply the story of an obsession that spiraled beyond control. It is the story of a system that prioritized its own smooth functioning over the safety of the person at its center. It is the story of what it costs when the people entrusted with protecting someone famous are also, in various ways, invested in keeping things quiet. Selena Quintanilla was 23 years old. She had already achieved more than most artists accomplish in a lifetime, and by every indication she was only just beginning. She deserved, in the most basic and uncomplicated sense, to grow old. She deserved to make her crossover album, to fight with her husband about ordinary things, to eventually step out from under her father's shadow and discover who she was entirely on her own terms. She deserved the future she had written about in journals that were never meant for anyone else's eyes. The mystery, when you finally sit with it honestly, was never really about who fired the gun. The mystery was always about everything that had to go wrong before she ever walked through that door. And now that it has been solved, now that 30 years of interviews, investigations, parole hearings, and slowly surfacing truths have laid it all out, the answer is exactly as uncomfortable as it always threatened to be.